Ever heard of an artist so versatile, he illustrated everything from, get this, Hunter S. Thompson's Wild Stories, to classic children's books?
Sounds like quite the resume.
Yeah, today's deep dive is all about Ralph Steadman, the man behind those iconic Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas illustrations, and so much more.
And trust me, when we say so much more, we mean it. This is a deep dive into the breadth of Steadman's work, his unique artistic voice, and why he deserves to be recognized as more than just the Thompson guy.
Right, because it's easy to see the name Steadman and just think gonzo, that wild, no-rule style. But we're talking about an artist who illustrated Alice in Wonderland, Treasure Island, even those quirky British oddbins catalogs.
It's almost like we're talking about multiple artists, right?
Yeah.
But that's the beauty of it. All these seemingly disparate threads are woven together by Steadman's distinct vision.
Okay, so before we get lost in the ink splatters, I gotta ask, who is Ralph Steadman? Where did this all begin?
Well, according to Wikipedia, his early life was anything but ordinary. He absolutely hated school, quit at 16, worked a bunch of odd jobs. Talk about an unconventional path to art world fame.
It's like something out of a movie. Radar operator one day, celebrated illustrator the next.
And that's what I find so fascinating about Steadman. He wasn't handed success, he worked for it. Those early jobs, as disconnected as they may seem, likely shaped his artistic sensibility in ways we might not even realize.
You think those technical skills he picked up, maybe even something as simple as precision drawing, found their way into his later work?
Absolutely, because even when you look at Steadman's most chaotic pieces, there's this underlying control, this attention to detail that likely stems from those formative experiences.
It's like what you call it earlier, controlled chaos.
Exactly. It's this fascinating juxtaposition that defines his work. But speaking of chaos, we can't talk about Ralph Steadman without talking about Hunter S. Thompson.
Right, the godfather of gonzo journalism.
Oh, yeah.
For those who don't know, we're talking about this wild, subjective style of writing where the lines between reality and, well, whatever Thompson's mind conjured up were pretty blurry.
And Steadman's art captured that perfectly. They weren't just writer and illustrator. They were two sides of the same coin, feeding off each other's energy. These weren't just articles they were working on either. The Kentucky Derby, the Honolulu Marathon.
Hold on. You're really piquing my curiosity here. What exactly were they getting up to at these events?
Picture this. It's the 1970 Kentucky Derby, a sea of hats and mint juleps. But Thompson's there to capture the underbelly, the darkness beneath the glamour. And Steadman's right there with him, sketching those distorted faces, those skewed perspectives, giving visual life to the raw, visceral feeling that words alone could never fully convey.
Wow. Suddenly I'm not just vaguely remembering the movie. I'm picturing it in all its chaotic glory. It's like Steadman's art added this whole other layer of meaning to Thompson's words.
And that's what makes their collaboration so iconic. They weren't just complimenting each other, they were pushing the boundaries of their respective crafts, pulling each other further into that gonzo abyss.
It's pretty incredible when you think about it. But as impactful as that collaboration was, Steadman's career didn't end there, did it?
Oh, not even close. And this is where things get really interesting. Because while those Thompson pieces might be his most famous, Steadman absolutely hated being pigeonholed as the gonzo guy. He even regretted selling the original Fear and Loathing artwork so cheaply.
Ouch. Talk about a cautionary tale for artists everywhere. But it sounds like we'll get to that later.
Absolutely. Because we're about to explore how Steadman, this artist who could have easily ridden the coattails of gonzo fame, chose to branch out, to lend his unique vision to everything from wine catalogs to children's literature.
All right, so we've got this artist, Ralph Steadman, who refuses to be put in a box. He works with Hunter S. Thompson, fine, but he's also illustrating classic literature, album covers, even wine catalogs.
And that's what makes him so fascinating. Because it would have been so easy to just become the gonzo guy, to keep churning out that same style and call it a day. But Steadman didn't. He pushed boundaries, experimented, and in doing so, he created this incredibly diverse body of work that still manages to feel cohesive.
You keep saying that cohesive. But what ties it all together? What makes a Steadman, even when the subject matter is so different?
It's the feeling you get when you look at his work, right? That sense of controlled chaos.
Yeah.
And it's more than just a visual style. It's the way he uses those visuals to tell a story, to make a point.
When you say controlled chaos, what does that look like in practice? Like, if we're looking at a Steadman illustration, what are we seeing?
Well, think about those ink splatters, for example. Those uncontrolled lines, the seemingly random splashes of ink. At first glance, it might seem messy, unplanned. But if you look closer, you realize that every mark is deliberate, placed with intention.
It's like he's somehow found a way to make chaos intentional.
Exactly. And that's where the controlled part comes in. Because it's not just about throwing ink on a page, it's about using those splatters, those wild lines, to create a specific feeling, to draw the viewer's eye to a particular detail.
And then there are those grotesque, exaggerated figures, the way he distorts faces and bodies. It's like caricature, but I don't know, more extreme.
Absolutely. He takes those familiar features like eyes or mouths and stretches them to their limits, creating these characters that are both absurd and strangely relatable. It's like he's amplifying their emotions, their inner turmoil, making it impossible to look away.
It's funny you should mention that. I was just looking at his illustrations for Alice in Wonderland. And even those classic characters, those beloved figures from our childhoods, they're all a bit off. Their eyes are bulging, their limbs are contorted.
Ah.
It's like he's revealing a darkness beneath the surface.
And isn't that what makes his work so compelling? Because even when he's tackling something lighthearted like children's literature, there's this underlying current of unease, this sense that maybe things aren't quite what they seem.
Which, let's be honest, is kind of Steadman's MO, right? Pushing
Honestly.
boundaries, challenging norms, making people feel a little uncomfortable.
Hmm.
I mean, this is a guy who ended up in legal battles over obscenity for a beer label.
Can you imagine? The great state of Colorado, a place practically built on craft breweries, freaking out over a beer label.
It does sound a little ridiculous, doesn't it? But I guess that's Steadman for you, always stirring the pot. But on a more serious note, it really makes you think about the role of art in society, about who gets to decide what's considered offensive or obscene. Right.
It's a question that's still relevant today. And whether you agree with Stedman's approach, whether you find his work offensive or brilliant or somewhere in between, there's no denying that he sparked a conversation. He made us think about those uncomfortable things, about the limits of free expression and the power of art to challenge our perceptions.
And that brings us back to this idea of Steadman as an artist, not just an illustrator. Because he wasn't content with simply putting someone else's words to paper. He used his art to make a statement. So we've gone on this journey. We've seen Steadman go from like radar operator to artistic rebel.
To a guy who literally shook up the art world with ink splatters and a healthy dose of social commentary.
And through it all, he never compromised his vision. Whether he was working with Thompson or illustrating classic literature, he always pushed those boundaries, made us see things from a different perspective.
And isn't that what makes a true artist? The ability to hold a mirror up to society, to challenge our perceptions, make us question what we think we know.
And to do it all with such a unique and instantly recognizable style. Seriously, nobody does ink splatters quite like Ralph Steadman.
Absolutely. But those ink splatters, they're more than just a visual quirk. They represent something deeper, that embrace of chaos, that willingness to push boundaries that defined both his work and his life.
It's funny you should mention that because I wanted to circle back to something we touched upon earlier. We've talked about how Steadman's art amplified Thompson's writing. But could it stand on its own? Would those images be as powerful if they weren't tethered to those gonzo tales?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, I'm not sure there's a clear-cut answer.
Because on the one hand, you could definitely argue that his Fear and Loathing work wouldn't be nearly as iconic without Thompson's words.
I mean, it's almost impossible to separate the two. Those images are forever intertwined with those stories.
Right. But then you've got his other work, the album covers, the children's book illustrations, even the beer labels that got him into so much trouble. That stuff wasn't directly tied to Thompson's words, yet it still packs a punch.
You're right. When you look at something like his album Art for the Who, for example, it's clear that Steadman's art could stand on its own, that it had a voice independent of any particular writer or musician.
So where does that leave us? If we had to sum up the legacy of Ralph Steadman, what would it be?
I think it boils down to this. Ralph Steadman was an artist who refused to be put in a box. He was a master of his craft, a fearless satirist, and a visual storyteller whose work continues to provoke, challenge, and inspire.
He made us question everything, from the nature of art itself to the limits of free expression. And he reminded us that sometimes the most powerful statements are made with a healthy dose of ink and a whole lot of heart.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the incredible world of Ralph Steadman. Hopefully, we've given our listeners plenty to think about, maybe even sparked a little inspiration to go out and create something beautifully chaotic of their own.